Vamos a sacudir el árbol de la ciencia biológica en su rama evolutiva para responder preguntas filosóficas con un filósofo de las ciencias, Frédéric Bouchard, un canadiense de la Universidad de Montreal que se dedica a pensar las grandes preguntas de siempre de la filosofía, pero con los datos de la biología evolutiva. ¿Qué relación hay entre la pregunta acerca de qué es un ser humano y, por ejemplo, las bacterias que habitan nuestro intestino? Lo escuchamos. Good afternoon, Frédéric Bouchard. Thank you so much for being here today in La Repregunta, el especial.
It's a pleasure.
Frédéric, you are a philosopher of biology. Why a philosopher decides to apply this interest in biology?
Actually, it's part of the tradition of philosophy itself. Aristotle, a famous philosopher, was keenly interested in understanding how biological organisms and biological systems informed our understanding of the world. So actually, although it's maybe lesser known than ethics or metaphysics or other areas of philosophy, philosophers have been interested in biology for centuries. And today, what that means is a philosopher of biology today basically looks to how biology helps us illuminate or illustrate some classical problems of philosophy, and conversely see how ways of looking at the world through philosophy can sometimes help biologists in their own work. So it goes in both directions. It's philosophy illuminated by a biology, but it's also hopefully biology inspired or helped by philosophical thinking.
Which kind of new research in the field of biology is leading you to new questions regarding what we are as human species or what we are as human beings?
So philosophers of biology, let's say starting in the 1950s and on, but mostly maybe in the 1980s and 90s, we're very interested in better understanding how evolutionary theory and evolutionary biology works, what kind of scientific theory it is, what kind of explanations it provides about the natural world. So philosophers of biology for the last few decades were very interested in various models and approaches in evolutionary biology.
When you say evolutionary biology, you are thinking of Charles Darwin and the idea of evolution as a species, or what idea, for example?
Well, Darwin, of course, starting with Darwin, but actually a lot of work was done throughout the 20th century in applying, let's say, Darwinian insights to biological processes using our growing understanding of genetics, population genetics. These are things that Darwin knew nothing about because it wasn't really discovered at the time. But evolutionary biology today is, let's say, the foundation is Darwin, but the models have been refined throughout the 20th century, in large part thanks to genetics, population genetics, but also a greater understanding of ecology. And ecology is looking at how different species interact in the living world. So all of these approaches in biology intersect in evolutionary biology to try to understand how species change in response to changes in the environment. So for a philosopher of biology, looking at this, it's understanding the dynamics of species and how species interact in response to natural selection. That's what Darwin described. But also more broadly, we talk a lot about climate change and how it affects the environments of species. Well, how that affects how species interact. So in the last maybe decade or 2 decades, this has touched our understanding of, for instance, Homo sapiens and the human species. Let's say for the last, prior to let's say the earlier in the 20th century and 19th century, we had this understanding of species kind of very as autonomous systems. So Homo sapiens, for instance, or you could take another species, we saw it as, let's say, one type of organisms that interacted with other species, but in a semi-autonomous way. But throughout the 20th century, we saw that actually organisms from different species interact in much more sustained ways, and it may be more difficult to say that we're fully autonomous from other species we interact with. So a word that we often hear is symbiosis. When we talk about symbiosis, we're talking about how organisms of different species fully depend on each other for their survival. And this affects how we see the relationship between species, and this affects how we should understand Homo sapiens.
Frédéric, this idea of this collaboration or this relationship among species, you are describing a kind of community or social behavior, or you are also speaking about how other species are inside our bodies or on our skin and are part of us also?
So it's not really in terms of social. So because social behavior is linked to some sort of cognition of organized behavior, but actually this involves organisms that have no real cognition or brains that we can speak of. So it could be social, but this is not really what's most prevalent in nature. What's prevalent in nature is that oftentimes, through evolution, instead of, let's say, developing new organs that help us process some types of food or some types of energy, various species have relied on organisms of other species to do the transformation. So it may be easier. There's a type of termite that eats wood, but that cannot digest wood. So what they do is actually, when they collect wood particles, they put them on mushrooms, and the mushrooms transform, they digest the wood for them, and then the termites can eat that mush of mushroom and wood. So in some sense, the digestion for these termites is done by mushrooms, by another
Very
species.
So
this is a type of symbiosis. This is the type of symbiosis that actually is very prevalent in nature, where organisms of species A depends on organisms of species B in order to survive.
Frédéric, but regarding this example, this case, the question of what an individual or a biological individuality is very shocking, because this termite is not ending in the boundaries of its own body, but there's a kind of continuity in the mushroom.
So this is the truly philosophical question. So what I've been speaking about so far is mostly biology, but for philosophers, the question of identifying individuals and understanding the boundaries of individuals is very important. Right now, we're speaking through the internet, right? So I'm interacting with you thousands of kilometers away. In some sense, a part of me is in Argentina with you, right? We're interacting causally. So for humans and communication, we're relatively comfortable in understanding how our boundaries go beyond our skin, right? But in biological processes, this is not just about the internet and human communication. Actually, in the biological world, there are a lot of these diffuse, ambiguous, if you will, causal interactions between organisms of different species. So saying that, for instance, let's say the boundaries or the frontiers of Frédéric and at my skin would make it impossible to understand how we can interact at a larger distance.
Yes.
So our boundaries should not be seen or understood as just about a physical barrier, but understanding how we work in the world and what do we need to work with, be it other species or technical tools, to make our survival possible.
So the concept of an individual when we are integrated with the internet, for example, begins to change because it's not attached anymore to the materiality of the concreteness of our body. And there's another kind of abstraction that in spite of the lack of real presence, you are not here, you are here in some way.
Well, it's, I'll give a simpler technological example.
Yes.
So if you wear glasses, you absolutely need your glasses to see and to interact with the world.
Yes.
The glasses are not biological, right? So there's a tool that helps you interact with the world, and that in a very real sense becomes a part of you, right? If you're very myopic, you absolutely need those glasses to interact with the world.
Yes.
So this is a technical tool that becomes a part of who you are, even though it's not biological.
Interesting.
You can extend that image to link to communication. It is physical, right? Because I am interacting with physical objects that translate, that translates my voice and my image into bits, and so there is a physicality to it.
Yes.
But it's not fully biological.
Yes.
And I think it's very difficult to understand how organisms and individuals function in the world if we limit their identity to the physical barriers that is constituted by their skin. Because actually, a lot of organisms have impacts on things beyond the physical limitations or the physical boundaries of their bodies. And so the internet is maybe a radical example, but actually in nature, there are a lot of these examples where organisms interact with other organisms in a permeable or diffuse fashion.
You have a very nice example. I have listened to the podcast in CBC Ideas where you describe the calamari and the light that some kind of calamaris, they are kind of shiny. Could you tell this story, please?
So there's this little squid. It's called it's a Hawaiian bobtail squid, and it's about this big, and it's what makes it very special is that it glows in the dark, right? So actually, when you look in the shallow waters of Hawaii, you'll see these little squids that we say bioluminescent. So there's this biological light that is emitted by the squid.
Yes.
And when you look at the physiology of the squid, actually the squid is not glowing. What is glowing is this bacterial colony that lives within the squid, and that when it's in high enough density, when there are enough bacteria in the little volume, there's this chemical cascade that generates light. So when you ask the question, okay, who's glowing?
Yes.
Well, the squid is not glowing by itself. The bacteria is not actually glowing by itself, because when it's living, in the free, in the sea,
yes.
It's not in high enough density to have the chemical reaction.
Yes, yes.
So the glowing is actually when the two species are together in very specific contexts.
Yes.
So who's glowing?
Yeah.
Well, in a kind of philosophical sense, it's the community, it's the interaction between the squid and the bacteria, the Vibrio fishery. But it's understanding it like this. The evolutionary question is, why is it glowing? Or, what, it's an adaptation for what purpose? And actually, biologists looking at this have found out this I love this example because it's very poetic. Actually, the predators for these squid hunt below the squid and they look up at the sea surface. And if they see a shadow, they know there's a prey, right? Because they know there's a little fish or a little squid that's above them, between the light and them. But if you're glowing, you don't cast a shadow. So in a kind of, it's poetic, but it's in a real biological sense, the squid and fishery together glow, and by glowing, it becomes invisible to predators that's looking for shadows and not for glowing spots in the sea. So we see, if we want to understand the survival of the Hawaiian bobtail squid, we have to take into account how it's working with organisms from another species for an essential adaptation that it depends on to survive.
Frédéric, from the squid to human beings, there is kind of bridge regarding these concepts you are describing. I'm thinking of this. Because of the coronavirus, we are reading a lot about viruses and how viruses are present in our lives without knowing it. And there is a lot of information that says that just 10% of our cells comes from Homo sapiens and 19% come from bacteria. It is part of our bodies. And on the other hand, we have today much more information regarding the microbiome in our guts and how important it is as a second brain, it is considered. So human beings now, from the point of view of this kind of new lens, bacteria inside of our bodies that are doing a very complex job, who are we? Are we just a body without the bacteria, or the bacteria are part of our bodies?
Well, so this, I'll take a small detour. So let's say you have heart problems and you get a transplant for an artificial heart, okay? So a mechanical artificial heart. Part of you is non-Homo sapiens.
Yeah.
You absolutely depend on it to survive. We would not tell that person that person is not human anymore. So just extend that image to other species. A lot of the microbiome is kind of the ensemble of bacteria that's inhabiting our guts, our intestines, in this case, for gut microbiome. So that microbiome helps us transform different foods into energy, construct fatty acids. It does chemical reactions that allows us to process food. We absolutely depend on these bacteria in order to have functioning digestion. Does that make us less human? Not really. In the same way that a mechanical heart doesn't make us less human, the fact that part of our good functioning depends on other species should not affect, what we think about human beings.
But it is a different way of being human. Because we tend to think that we as humans are very unique, layers of cultural and social influences over the centuries and over the years, and we do not connect this nature, this human being nature, with the other species in our bodies.
I think that's an important point you're raising, is that we should not see human beings as being apart or above the rest of nature. And we are part of nature. And not just because we're living organisms, because we fully depend on other species to survive. So we're not just a big primate under the sun.
Yeah. But this species, Frédéric, because the species you are speaking about in this point is not the species that surrounds us in the environment, but the species that are inside us. We are a kind of Lego made of different species.
We are, but even if they were outside of us, I think we should have the same view of nature. So the fact that they're inside us makes it more dramatic, right? That we do have these microorganisms that we fully depend on for our good functioning, and they are inside us. But even if they were outside of us, and we had the same dependency on these other organisms from this other species.
Like with the glasses.
Like the glasses, right? The fact that they're out, right? The organisms I'm talking about are inside, but even if they were outside, and actually we've got a lot of bacteria on our outside that helps us, function in the world. And inside, outside, what I find more telling is whether we function together. And this functioning doesn't have to be internal. It could be external to us. An example of this is if you open your mouth, there's bacteria in there. Is this bacteria inside or outside of you? Well, if you have your mouth closed, they're inside.
Yes.
But if you open your mouth, they're kind of outside as well. And so it's not inside, outside is not, I think, the most interesting or essential aspect of the relationship. The interesting or essential aspect of the relationship is that we function together and for survival. And this to me, whether it's inside, outside, whether it's, in direct proximity or just at a distance,
yes.
It's the same issue. We work, all biological organisms depend on other species to survive. They're causally related. There's a causality, cause and effect with other species. And I think for human beings, this is a lesson of humility because it reminds us that we are really fully, essentially part of nature,
Frédéric,
and not an organism that's distinct of nature.
Two last questions. Do you think that in terms of the description you are doing, that human beings are super individuals? What is a super individual, and are human beings super individuals?
So if super individual means that you have a biological individual that's constituted of organism from different species, I think human beings are definitely super individuals. Definitely. So I use the word super individual instead of super organism, but super organism, when we talk about termite colonies or ant colonies as superorganisms, we usually mean a collection of organisms from the same species working as a whole, right? But super individual, I think is more appropriate, is here. I don't assume that actually, from what we know of biology, we should understand most organisms as actually super individuals constituted of organisms from different species. In our case, in my case, in your case, we're constituted of a big Homo sapiens, a big primate, working together with microbes, with bacteria from other species to do things like process food, transform energy, mediate different chemicals, and so on. So we are
influencing our mind through this second brain. No, this is a new boundary in this influence of microbiome in our bodies, in our well-being, and our human being existence.
So this is work that's being conducted now. So we'll see what the science tells us. But as soon as you accept the idea that the brain, is a physical organ and that it's affected by different chemical signals and molecules, well, if the gut processes a lot of processes and food sources and so on, we shouldn't be surprised that it could affect behavior. Second brain, I think, is too strong. But I would say that what research tells us currently is that the gut microbiome can affect human behavior and human feelings or human states, mental processes.
Yes.
But we don't know to what extent.
Okay.
So we don't know whether it's minor effects or big effects. I think my big primate brain is much more significant in how I interact and how I understand the world. But I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of interactions in our gut with our microbiome could affect, how we feel and how we see the world.
Frédéric, the very last question is, in the States, in Argentina, in many countries, there is a social and political problem which is called, in Argentina, the crack, la grieta, the fracture between one way of conceiving political issues and the other. In the States is Trumpism against anti-Trumpism. And this very divided society could be conceived in a different way if we consider that we as human beings in the same society are like part of a big organism and the collaboration could work differently?
Well, so the question of polarization in politics
yes.
is this is not my field of study, so I'll leave it to my colleagues to speak about it. But I don't think this leads necessarily to the idea that humanity is a big emergent organism. I don't think it necessarily leads to that. Philosophically, let's say in a broader context, I would say that we need to be much more mindful about how we treat each other in general, because we depend on each other for survival. So I would say, to me, this thinking about biology, we shouldn't link it up directly to, let's say, political thought. I would put it that way. But I think what it should remind us is that we should conceive of our place in nature with more humility and treat other species with more respect, or if you will, more. We should consider their well-being as important to our own well-being, and for how human beings, if that's true of us with other species, well, maybe we should treat each other human beings, with more respect and consideration. Because ultimately, our survival, our well-being depends on how we treat each other and other species.
Great. Thank you so much, Frédéric Bouchard, for being here in La Repregunta, el especial. It was a pleasure.
My pleasure.
Thank you.